Hi and welcome back to No Book Left Behind. I'm your host Mark, and today I'm looking at 3 more volumes of the British Library's Tales of the Weird series. Cheers. So what weird delights have the British Library got for us this time? Well, we have Evil Roots, Killer Tales of the Botanic Gothic, which I actually talked about a little bit in my mid-month reading roundup video for March. We've got Promethean Horrors, Classic Tales of Mad Science. And lastly, we've got Roarings from Further Out, 4 weird novellas by Algernon Blackwood. Now, I actually already talked about this one in my top 10 books of 2025 video because I read it a little earlier than the others, because when I first discovered Tales of the Weird, I just bought 3 of them in a job lot, and this happened to be one of them, and I read it last year. And this was before I decided that I was going to go through the entire series and review them 3 books at a time in order of publication. So that explains why I'm talking about that one again. Now, before I get into talking about any of the books in depth, I'm going to get on my soapbox about something. And if you've watched my videos about Tales of the Weird before, you might be able to guess what this is, because I have mentioned it before, and it's repetition of stories. Because Evil Roots contains Rappaccini's Daughter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Now that is perfectly fair. It's an important selection for this volume, because in a lot of ways you could argue that this was the foundational work of botanic horror, if you want to call it this odd subgenre by that title. So yeah, it's important it's here. And editor Daisy Butcher probably didn't have all that many stories to choose from anyway, so perfectly understandable, don't have a problem with it. However, it had already appeared in the Tales of the Weird series in book number 4, which is called Mortal Echoes Encounters with the End, and that had been published only 10 months earlier. But yeah, I can see why it's in Evil Roots. However, it also appears in Promethean Horrors, the very next volume in the series, and I do find that extremely disappointing. Now, I appreciate that these editors obviously work independently, wouldn't cross-reference their selections with each other or anything, but didn't someone at the British Library notice this and go back to the editor of Promethean Horrors and say, well, we've just published this story less than 30 days earlier. Could you select something else? I would have hoped that sort of thing would happen, but obviously it didn't in this particular case. But yeah, I do find that very disappointing. Now, I don't tend to look at the lists of stories that appear in these anthologies when I buy them. I leave that for the time when I'm about to read them, when I'm about to do a TBR video about them. So I don't know if this is something that occurs frequently within the series, or whether it was just teething problems early on. But it does tend to take a shine off things a little bit, and I think that's a shame, because I'm thoroughly enjoying this series otherwise. So now I've got that off my chest, let's look at the individual volumes, beginning of course with Evil Roots, Killer Tales of the Botanic Gothic. Now, I come to the Tales of the Weird series looking for new authors, or to try authors whose names I know, but I've never had the privilege of trying any of their work before. Now, here, unfortunately, what I found was that aside from Rappaccini's Daughter, there were another 4 tales that I was already very familiar with, from H.G. Wells, Arthur Conan Doyle, William Hope Hodgson, and M.R. James. And those last 2, their stories here are particularly good. So it was a pleasure to read them again. But as I say, I'm looking for new material. And I was left with 9 stories that fell into that category here. And I have to say that as I was working my way through the book, I was really underwhelmed by it. The first 4 of those just didn't do anything for me at all, really. They were fine, but just nothing remarkable. Luckily, when I got to the last 4, I found things turned around, and these were easily my favourite 4 of the new material that I hadn't read before. And the first of these was The Pavilion by E. Nesbit, which is a really lovely mixture of creepy horror and murder mystery. And it's not the first time we've come across Nesbit in the Tales of the Weird series either, because she had a story in Spirits of the Season, the 5th book in the series, called The Shadow, and I pointed that one out, I believe, as being one of the outstanding ones in that particular collection. So this is interesting because E. Nesbit is known in the UK as a children's author, particularly for the author as being the author of Five Children and It, which was turned into a television show for kids, and The Railway Children, which was turned into a very famous film in 1971, which, when I was growing up, was a bank holiday staple of children's television in the UK. So to find her doing horror is, well, just a little bit strange. And in fact, she did do quite a few supernatural tales, and they've actually been collected in one volume, which has gone on to the list of books I'm going to buy when my book buying ban is over and I'm through my Read What You Own challenge, because I really like the two stories I've read. But what it did bring to mind to me was an interesting thing about authors around the turn of the 20th century, because we're told now that as an author you should stay in your lane, that you should only really write in one genre because that's what the audience expects. But there didn't seem to be that kind of practice back then, because I can think of a couple of very good examples, Robert W. Chambers and Bram Stoker. Now, both of them were, especially Stoker, obviously, were famous for their horror tales. Chambers particularly for his collection The King in Yellow, and Stoker for Dracula, Jewel of the Seven Stars, Lair of the White Worm, Lady of the Shroud, if you count that. It's borderline horror, I guess, and some of his short stories too. But you know what those two guys did otherwise? They wrote romantic fiction. Yeah. In fact, if you pick up a copy of Chambers' The King in Yellow paperback, which I do have one of those, half of it is romance, because they ran out of horror stories after about 3 or 4, and so they had to fill it up with some of his romance. The King in Yellow itself, the lead-off story, is an absolute classic, though. It's well worth picking up the volume just for that. With Stoker, he did do quite a few other volumes, or novels rather, that were romance, that you would probably call, if you're watching from over the pond in America, Hallmark kind of things. But in the UK, we call them Mills and Boon, basically after that publication. Yeah, because they are just corny romance. One I particularly remember was just called The Man, which was about a shipwrecked sailor who's nursed back to health by the lady of the manor in her castle. But he's got no memory, and he's just like a commoner, obviously. So the fact they fall in love, but, you know, they can never be together because of the difference in social standing. But of course, he gets his memory back and finds he's the lord of something or the duke of something, whatever. And so they get married at the end, and that's it. So yeah, it's a real corny romance novel. So interesting, but maybe those authors, as I say, back then didn't have to stay in their lane quite so much as they seem to be not forced to now, but encouraged to now, shall we say. Anyway, I've drifted off the point rather a lot there, as usual. But moving on from Nesbit, we also have a story by H.C. McNeill called The Green Death, which is similar in the sense that it ties a murder plot into the horror. I rather like that one. That was really good. Then there's a precursor to body horror with Emma Vine's, or sorry, is it Vine or Vane? It's Vane, sorry. Emma Vane's The Moaning Lily, which is a very curious and very interesting story. And lastly, there's one from A.A. Merritt called Women of the Woods, which I really did enjoy. And I wasn't looking forward to that one at all, because if you've been a long time subscriber to the channel, you may remember I really had a go at his novel The Moon Pool in one of my Lost World Literature videos, because I really hated that. So yeah, I didn't really expect much of Women of the Wood at all. I expected to be very bored, but it was very good. I really did enjoy it, and it's kind of put a couple of Merritt's other famous titles back on my to-read list, because I kind of scratched them off after reading The Moon Pool, to be honest with you. But overall, in the end, it's a solid collection. These last 4 stories, plus the quality of the ones I'd already read, do elevate it to a solid collection, a solid anthology of stories as part of the Tales of the Weird series. So it is worth picking up. Moving on to the next volume in the series, that's Promethean Horrors, Classic Tales of Mad Science. And my thoughts on this were very similar to my thoughts on Evil Roots, because there's 10 tales here. 4 of them I'd already read. I was very familiar with them indeed. There's Poe's The Facts of the Case of M. Valdemar. There's H.P. Lovecraft's From Beyond, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Body Snatcher, and of course Rappaccini's Daughter again. And these are all very, very fine tales indeed, so they form a very solid spine to the collection. But it left me only 6 stories that I didn't know. So let's plunge into those. First of these was The Sandman by E.T.A. Hoffmann. Now, I've always wanted to read some Hoffmann because I thought he sounded like he might be my kind of dude. But I found The Sandman to be awkward, clumsy, and not very well written. Now, you do have to take into account this is over 200 years old, and it's translated from the German. Having said that, though, I've read plenty of literature of that vintage and had no problem with it at all. This I just found to be really poorly structured. It kind of rambled. I was fairly bored most of the time, I must admit. So this was a major disappointment for me because I'd always intended to pick up a collection of Hoffmann's material because, as I say, I really thought it would be something that I'd really enjoy, but not on this evidence, no. Of a similar vintage is Mary Shelley's The Mortal Immortal, a tale. And I approach this with some trepidation because I've read all her longer works, but aside from Frankenstein, I didn't enjoy them very much. In fact, The Last Man, the one I was particularly looking forward to because it's about civilization being wiped out by a plague, I found that a real slog to get through, really hard going. So I didn't have great hopes for The Mortal Immortal, but I did find it enjoyable. I thought there were some interesting themes there. I saw the original 1958 movie of The Fly way before I saw the David Cronenberg version, but I did enjoy both of them. However, until I picked this book up, I did not realise they were based on a short story by a British-French author called Georges Langelaan. Apologies for pronunciation there. And I certainly enjoyed this one, and it was interesting to me that the 1958 movie, at least, was such a faithful adaptation of it. And guess who else is here? Yes, it's E. Nesbit again with The Five Senses, which I thought was a very original concept and a very interesting tale indeed about a scientist whose experiment leads to a premature burial. Yeah, I've got to pick up that anthology of her shorter works for sure. Best of all, though, was The Blue Laboratory by L.T. Mead, and her presence here kind of confirms what I was saying earlier in the video about writers not necessarily staying in their lane at the start of the 20th century, because Mead was by far best known for her works aimed at young teenage girls, stories often set in boarding schools and the like. So horror wasn't something she was really very well known for, although she did publish over 280 books in her lifetime, so some genre hopping was probably inevitable, I would guess. All her horror work has been collected in an anthology called Eyes of Terror and Other Dark Adventures, and yeah, I'm probably going to be picking that up at some point, I think. So overall, my thoughts on Promethean horrors was similar to Evil Roots, really. In the end, it's a solid collection of tales, but nothing very spectacular in the context of the series. Finishing up, we've got Roarings from Further Out, 4 weird novellas by Algernon Blackwood. Now, before reading this volume, my total knowledge of Blackwood was that he'd written a famous story called The Wendigo, which I'd never read, and that he was a member of the occult society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn at the early part of the 20th century, whose membership also included notorious Satanist Aleister Crowley. Now, the 4 novellas here contain what are arguably his 2 most famous works. Firstly, we have The Willows, which is about 2 guys travelling by canoe down the river Danube who are forced to spend the night on a small mud island thrown up by floodwaters and surrounded by banks of weeds and willows. In The Wendigo, we have a small hunting party in the forests of Canada whose guide becomes increasingly nervous talking about local folk legends before he disappears. When they go searching for him, all they can find at first is these really large inhuman footprints. The other 2 novellas are Ancient Sorceries, which is about a humble tourist who on impulse gets off a crowded train at a small mountain village. At first it seems like a romantic idyll, but then he begins to feel that all the villagers are watching him all the time and their behaviour gets increasingly stranger. Lastly, we come to The Man Whom the Trees Loved, which is about an elderly couple living on the edge of the New Forest. The man has spent his whole career working for the preservation of the environment and feels a spiritual connection to the trees. The trees seem to return that affection, though, at the exclusion of his wife. The first thing to note here is that these are substantial tales running to 60 or 70 pages. However, we don't get a huge amount of plot. Instead, we get a lot of descriptive passages, mostly of nature and the environment. Now, I'm not normally a fan of that at all, because I get impatient waiting to know what happens next in the story and to the characters. Case in point would be Lord of the Rings. Now, of course, I've read those books, but I didn't love them, and that was the main reason for it. Although I did learn a lot of new names for small groups of trees. There was that. But before you unsubscribe, I did enjoy the films, so there is that. However, when it comes to Blackwood's tales, it's different, because these passages of description aren't just a matter of the author trying to convey what he's seeing in his mind's eye to the reader. Blackwood uses them instead to create mood and a sense of threat and dread, and he is an absolute master at it. Somehow Blackwood manages to convey this feeling of man's lonely, vulnerable place in the universe, at the mercy of unknowable yet inexorable forces. Things you see operating just out of the corner of your eye, but of course, once you turn your head to look at them, they're gone. But the memory will haunt you for the rest of your life and will never leave your dreams. It feels very Lovecraftian to me and incredibly effective. The stories also really benefit from their settings, the endless wilderness of the Willows, the miles of unmapped backwoods in the Wendigo, even the depths of England's New Forest, which somehow reach farther out. It's hard for me to pick a favourite here because I felt the collection exerted a slowly tightening grip on me as I read the stories, and perhaps that was the intention of editor Xavier Aldano Reyes when he placed them in the particular order that they are. Whatever it was, I'll definitely be returning to more Blackwood in the future, and this is quite easily my favourite Tales of the Weird volume so far, and as I've said earlier, this actually did feature in my top 10 fiction books of 2025. Have you read any of these books? What did you think of them? Please feel free to disagree with my opinions in the comments below, and more importantly, please leave your suggestions for any other weird fiction that you think I might enjoy. So that's it for today. Thank you for sticking with me right the way through to the end of the video, and if you've enjoyed it, why not take a moment to hit that like button? And if you're not a subscriber, why not consider subscribing to the channel as well? That way you won't miss any more of my reviews of the Tales of the Weird series. And before I go, in the meantime, please don't forget to keep searching through those dusty second-hand bookshops in the narrow streets of your town, to keep visiting those market stalls and car boot sales and rummaging through those charity bins, because there are treasures out there that only you can find. Be seeing you. So to finish with volume 12 in the series, this is Roarings from Further Out, 4 weird novellas by Aleister Crowley.